Hi, I'm Leishaa. I'm currently studying in IBDP 1 and I've taken economics, business management, and maths in my HLs as part of the IB program. Well, when we saw about this, like the climate change, and we heard about you, we've read about you, I felt like a connection because I really care about the ecosystem and like just the environment around us and how we've always been like so stressed about everything when it's not entirely our generation's fault. So it's it's kind of stressful knowing you have to live with it and kind of work around it whenever we've been in parks or like in the middle of the fields when you see a lot of pollution when like burning of fields and all that. So that can be really intimidating. And even through CAS, like I have especially been trying to work and like helping like with awareness. So I thought there was a great opportunity for us to discuss, and it's really nice work that you've done. It's really commendable.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's I think what you're kind of speaking to are those feelings of eco anxiety. And I think there are lots of young people in particular who are very aware of the climate and ecological crisis that we've inherited, are very aware of the kind of injustice and centuries long history of exploitation of people and commodification of nature that have really led to this moment in time. And I think as young people, we're very aware that, you know, as much as we can take to the streets and protest and use social media and use our voices, the people who are ultimately in decision making spaces, those in power are a lot older, and it's really easy to feel excluded from the decisions ultimately affecting our collective future. So yeah, those feelings that you're describing are absolutely normal, and I think are affecting more and more young people in particular. But they're really they're not just rational. I think they're necessary because we've gotten so good as a culture at kind of switching off from these problems. It's really easy when you're like doom scrolling or seeing the media all the time to just want to kind of shut off from it. But eco anxiety or some of those feelings you alluded to are really a sign that you care, and they're proof of your humanity, and they're the internal alarm bells that are necessary to tell us that something is really wrong and we need to change the path that we're on.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm aware of this whole idea of eco anxiety that has surfaced recently through a lot of the things that you put on your website. And I know that everybody has a different reason of how they actually begin to look at the environment. For me personally, I'm somebody that has grown up in various countries, and I've always ended up living in tropical countries, Nigeria, Brunei, India, always grown up in the environment, immersed in all the wildlife. And I've visibly been able to see the impacts of climate change, and it's been painful. It's just horrible. And that has driven me to take more actions towards helping the environment. But so I want to ask you the same question. What sparked the movement in you? And how do you still continue to help the environment now that you have a huge organization that you're a part of and that you've developed?
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, similarly, grew up in the tropics. So until the age of 13, I grew up in tropical North Queensland in Australia, and then I moved to Bali in Indonesia. But I think similarly, I was really lucky to grow up immersed in nature. I remember fishing frogs out of the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. If you haven't been to Australia, all the rumors are true. We have all the creepy crawlies and slithering creatures you can imagine. But I was so blessed to spend more time outside than in. I had very hands-off parents, so I'd spend hours as a young child just, exploring the bush with my best friend, my dog Billy, a border collie. And so that really planted in me this deep appreciation for the nature all around me, seeing the interconnectedness, our dependency on nature. But when I was 11, that all kind of changed because I discovered documentaries. And I remember sitting glued to my computer screen, staring at these images of, million-year-old forests being bulldozed to produce McDonald's Big Macs, and, watching time-lapse images of the reef where I spent my weekends diving, the Great Barrier Reef, turning white and dying because of these mass bleaching events. And so suddenly my relationship with nature was not just one of love, it was this real kind of bittersweet feeling of, we have all of this abundance around us, this abundance of life, and yet we're destroying it. And I remember amidst that feeling this deep sense of grief and feeling frustration. But I think more than anything, as I sat in front of my computer, I remember feeling really, really confused. I couldn't understand why I hadn't learned about the climate and ecological crisis in school, why we hadn't talked about it at the dinner table, why I hadn't seen it on the TV when my parents watched the news. And so it was at that moment that I really wanted to understand why it is that people shut down in the face of the climate crisis, and particularly those of us in a bubble of climate privilege, someone like me who learned about climate change by reading about it and watching documentaries about it, not living through the impacts of the climate crisis. And really this obsession with wanting to understand how we empower people to take action on an issue that is so overwhelming and super complex and is increasingly in the media, but where there's still not much clarity on what we can actually do to make a difference. So that was the backdrop to starting Force of Nature. And now being a 15-person team, my role is to keep steering the organization forward, and also to communicate some of these messages out to the wider world. So I do a lot of public speaking and going into schools, because that's my favorite thing, is actually getting to connect with young people who are just as passionate about this stuff.
That's really nice that you're going out there and letting people know. Like, there's a lot of people that are not aware of eco anxiety, and it's kind of, you've been suffering or like at least going through it for a very long time, and it's really nice to reach out to people and then let them know that there's something we can do about it. So I've seen a lot of people be part of the Youth of Nature program, and all those, like, I wanted to know how you like train them into like working with Force of Nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So to start, Force of Nature, it was really important that we researched this rise of mental health problems before we tried to design solutions, right, to respond to it. So, I intuitively, before starting Force of Nature, working in schools and having conversations with young people, realized that there was this rise of mental health issues in direct response to not just the climate crisis, but specifically inaction in the face of it. So a lot of young people feeling deeply disillusioned about the so-called leaders we have elected to safeguard our future, or deeply frustrated by, the blatant greenwashing of companies that spend more trying to convince us that they're doing the right thing rather than actually doing the right thing. And so I intuitively sensed that this was a thing, and I could see it within myself, but at that time there wasn't actually language. There wasn't a word called eco-anxiety. So it was kind of like stumbling through the dark. So we started research, and out of that research, first in the UK, we found that over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds experience eco-anxiety, which is an umbrella term for, grief, frustration, anger, sadness in response to the climate crisis. And then earlier this year, we partnered with other researchers and big universities to do the largest ever piece of research into youth mental health and climate. And so we surveyed 10,000 young people across 10 countries. And from that research, we found that 56% of young people believe that humanity is doomed. So that's a pretty heavy statistic, right? And I think, again, is evidence of this feeling experienced by young people. And what was really striking about this research was also that those feelings of eco-anxiety were most heightened in young people already living through the climate crisis. So in countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, in the global south, largely, young people are hyper aware of how their environment is changing and the impact that's having on their communities. So for one, we had to build up that evidence base, right? And then we had to figure out, okay, how do we actually help people translate these really normal feelings into action, right? Because the goal isn't to get rid of eco-anxiety, it's to bring emotional awareness to those feelings within you, emotional literacy, so you can understand how you're feeling, and then agency, so you can think about how do I actually translate those feelings into making a difference in the world. So from that, Force of Nature's programs were born, and we've now run our kind of flagship program with thousands of young people around the world in 50 plus countries, which uses tried and tested interventions to help them translate eco-anxiety into action. But then we also realized earlier this year, okay, it's not enough to just help young people feel empowered. We need to have the skills, the expertise, the focus to actually make a difference in the world. And from that, we designed 3 training pathways. The first of which is a speaker's training, so how to actually communicate your story. The second is advising decision makers in business and policy. So how do you go into these corridors of power, whether it's at COP27, the global meeting for climate, or it's into a boardroom of a big company? And how do you really challenge the way that leaders think about the issue? How do you galvanize them to action? And then the third pathway is our Train the Trainer. So that's where we actually train young people to deliver Force of Nature programs. Everyone in the organization is a young person. We're really here to represent and embody the young people that we seek to serve. And so there's now this like beautiful cycle of young people who've gone through programs who are now going into their own communities, their own schools, to empower their peers in the same way that we've hoped to empower them. And the final piece of this for us is really getting young people into long-term employment. So thinking about how do we make activism sustainable, and how do we not make it a privilege, right? Because in the UK, for example, there's a lot of unpaid labor around activism. So there's an expectation that you volunteer or you do good work just because you're motivated by it, right? But in my opinion, this should be the best paid work in the world, alongside teaching, for example. It's like, this is how you contribute to society. So we want to create long-term employment for young people to actually find careers in social justice and in sustainability.
That is a very impressive forum that you've made. It's not only global, it's intergenerational as well. And I think it's quite justifying in a way, because it allows not only the youth to cope with these problems that they didn't bring on themselves, it gives older generations the chance to rectify as well. And I have a question about this. I mean, you have a 5-week program that in which you train all these activists from all around the world to not only cope with the emotions that they're going through, but also to, in a way, be able to learn how they can help the environment. And I read on your website that by the end of it, they have a youth advisory board in which they can pitch ideas that maybe Force of Nature can then continue to implement. So I want to ask, what is the degree of change that participants of this program have been able to make so far? What is the degree of creativity that has come from this program so far?
Yeah, such a good question. So this is the kind of like 2 hands clapping approach, right? It's the recognition that, we have this generation of young people who are feeling increasingly disillusioned, who we need to empower to take action. And at the same time, we have all of these leaders in existing decision-making spaces who need to think in a radically different way about how we solve this problem. I've personally sat on dozens of advisory boards in Fortune 50 companies, in large organizations, directly consulting CEOs and C-suites. And if there's one thing I've learned through those experiences, it's that we're not going to solve the climate crisis with the same people and the same types of thinking that created it. And unfortunately, the mainstream mindset right now within business, for example, is, business as usual. It's how do we maintain the status quo, even though we know that the status quo is climate crisis increasingly and climate collapse. And so a lot of the current solutions that are proposed and kind of at the center of global discourse around climate really just plaster over the problems, right? They're like band-aids on a gaping wound. And so you need to go much deeper to the heart of the problem. You need to think, how do companies create value in society, for example? How do decision makers think about politics in a long-term way rather than just short-term cycles, premised on getting into power, but not actually creating institutional change? And so we're equipping young people to go into those spaces and disrupt thinking in those kind of ways. And from setting up youth advisory boards, this is not part of our work that we necessarily advertise, but a direct result of setting up youth advisory boards has been that people within those companies leave their companies because for them, they can no longer reconcile the cognitive dissonance of showing up to work every day, knowing how deeply they're part of the problem. And you mentioned the word intergenerational, which is so important and really at the heart of what we do. When we go into these companies and ask them, why are you talking to a bunch of teenagers or 20-year-olds about the climate crisis? It's never because they've read, the IPCC report or because they went to COP. It's because their kids came home to them at the end of the day and asked, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about the climate crisis? So young people, children, we have an incredible power to get under the skin of people in existing decision-making spaces. And even when the science and the statistics are not enough to galvanize them to action, that reflection on what is the world that I'm handing over to my children, or what is my legacy, that can be the thing that pushes them to true action. So it's really for us about those mindset shifts and completely redesigning so many of the kind of institutions and organizations that we've inherited.
I really love the perspective of how that you mentioned. It's not just about how children and how like they're going to influence and work on it just because they're going to live longer and live in this world, but it's also about how it's their parents, and there's a lot of parents out there that would genuinely want to work towards it, not only to just show that like their kids that they care, but it's also because they want a better world. And it's high time that we're responsible for our own actions and kind of work towards it.
I was gonna add on, like, I feel like a lot of people our age in the same position because there's so many people, like so many teenagers that have already decided that they don't want to have children simply because of the state of the world. And I feel like that's sort of the same mindset that our parents sometimes go through, and that's at least one of the reasons that leads them to figure out how they can help.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when I started out as an environmentalist, I was very lucky to actually leave Australia when I was 13 and go to a place called the Green School, which is wall-less bamboo classrooms in the middle of the jungle. And Green School was, not just unique for its compost toilets and the fact that we grew food on campus, but because it asked me which problems in the world I wanted to solve. And I remember doing this class on greenwashing where I got to, read into the companies that spend billions of dollars on marketing campaigns, again, convincing us that they're part of the solution rather than just investing in the actual solution. But being outside of those spaces of power, it was really easy to assume that people in power are just bad, right? And I was like, the world is run by people who are greedy, who don't care. We failed to solve the climate crisis from this place of contempt and maliciousness. And, it was very easy from that grassroots perspective to cling on to those beliefs. And what was so eye-opening when I started having conversations with those policymakers or those business leaders is that more often than not, they cared just as deeply as I did about the problems, right? But they too felt powerless. In the same way an 11 or 12-year-old in the classroom might feel powerless to make a difference, they also felt, well, I don't know how to do anything differently, right? I feel shackled to the status quo. And a lot of leaders, they've been part of this global narrative and mythology that convinces us that making money, getting a good job, buying a car, buying a second car, this constant pursuit of consumerism will make us happy, will mean that we can provide for our families, when in reality, that constant treadmill is, of course, a detriment to all of us, right? And our world. And so I think it's a huge shift that needs to happen in terms of what we consider aspirational. And it's also really empowering from my perspective to realize that organizations are not these, insurmountable, impenetrable fortresses. Organizations are collections of teams which are made up of individuals, right? And so long as we can change the mindsets of the individuals within those organizations, we can change how these huge organizations actually work. And it just, again, reminds us that these people are human. More often than not, they want to do the right thing, but we need to make it as clear as possible what that actually looks like. And to the point that was made earlier, the creativity and imagination that youth bring into the equation is a really powerful way of shining light on what that path can actually look like.
You're right. Like how you mentioned with the companies, that there's a lot of leaders where they really want to make a difference, and it's kind of like a nudge. Like if there's someone out there that's going to help us, so they really want to work towards it. But you know how there's a lot of glorification towards the hustle culture, and like with a lot of like value towards money. I wanted to ask you, how do you create like plans for such huge industries? Like you mentioned the Fortune 500.
For one thing, we are very clear on our area of expertise, and we lean on others where we don't have certain expertise. And I think that's a good life lesson in general, is kind of knowing what you're good at and when to ask for help. So for us, when it comes to creating change within companies, a lot of our role as young people kind of agitating and disrupting mindsets in those spaces is to open the door to them thinking in a much more transformational way. But that's where it's really important to bring in climate scientists, for example, and sustainability strategists who can actually talk about what a green transition looks like. But again, oftentimes it means completely rethinking how an organization creates value. So a really simple example, we kind of live within this throwaway culture, right? And I know growing up in Indonesia, I saw that firsthand. I saw the waste and the trash washing up on the shores from other countries. And so, a lot of companies have kind of had no responsibility for the stuff they make and where it actually ends up. But now in the climate and ecological crisis, companies have to completely change their sphere of responsibility and influence to recognize that it's not just our responsibility to think about what goes into a product and how it gets on the shelf, but it's our responsibility to think about who made that product and where that product actually ends up. And so that's where new kind of business models come in, like circular economy business models, where a company that might have previously made a shampoo bottle that is full of chemicals, and then the product itself ends up in a waterway, is now thinking, how do we create a fully reusable system with better ingredients, sustainably and ethically sourced ingredients, and how do we make it that that person owns that bottle of shampoo for their entire lives, so that there's a closed loop and it's not a kind of linear waste system. And so that's where bringing experts in to actually think about the huge technological shifts and solutions that are needed are really, really important. So there is a transition for certain companies, right? But for some companies, specifically a lot of fossil fuel, oil and gas companies, there isn't actually a transition. And those companies basically need to die out is the short version of that. Even if we look at, the rise of renewables, in most parts of the world today, it's actually cheaper to make renewable energy. But that transition has not happened because of the incumbent oil and gas companies. That change has happened because of disruptor renewable companies, right? Companies where their whole value creation is based on renewable energy. And so the transition, again, is not going to necessarily come from the people in existing spaces of power. It's naturally going to come from the new organizations and disruptors who can see a really different way of doing business. And that's why for us, long-term success is oftentimes not actually, a company, a huge incumbent company that employs tens of thousands of people. It's not necessarily helping that company sustain indefinitely. It's what does a very different model look like? And sometimes that means people leaving that organization so that they can go and work in other spaces that are actually driving the change. So it takes a lot of different skill sets and a lot of different expertise. But for us, our role is really being that initial catalyst. And then we can bring in the materials experts and the researchers and the scientists to help us think about what that transition looks like.
Wait, okay, I have a question here because one, I'm a business student, and two, I am the daughter of two people that work in a big time oil and gas company. Both my parents work for Shell. So I've never seen the whole model or the green concept really being taken as the primary focus. But so how do you exactly create a green scheme for big companies that is still profitable for them, because they can, of course, they can invest all this money because they're big, but then they need to be earning that revenue to ensure that they hold their market share. So is that something that you help with, or is that something the company does on their own?
I think if we look bigger picture, I mean, this is part of the challenge, right? Is that companies currently, they're imperative because of the legal articles of how a company or an LLC is set up. Their imperative is to make money for a really small group of people, aka their shareholders. And so it's very short term. It's very much how do we make profit without necessarily considering the unintended consequences of making that profit. And now two things are changing that dynamic. For one, regulation, where it's increasingly going to be more and more difficult for companies to operate in the way that they've been working. If you even look at the tobacco industry, it shows a really good example of what a decline of an incredibly polluting, damaging industry can look like. Part of the reason it's fallen to its knees in large parts of the world is because of litigation. So there are states, for example, in America that are actually suing tobacco companies because they're saying, you knew the science, you knew what you were doing was harmful, and yet you continue to do it in pursuit of profit. And that's similarly what is going to happen to fossil fuel companies as well. It's already happening with governments suing big companies like Shell, and it's also happening with young people suing their own governments for inaction on climate. The other thing is environmental change, right? And environmental collapse. We have worked with fast fashion companies, for example, where, they might create their products through cotton. In 20 years' time, it's going to be completely unviable to make the amount of clothes that we're making now through cotton, because large parts of the world and cotton producers are going to be underwater because of climate collapse, right? So it's a pretty grim picture. But if companies even look 10 years into the future, they can see that there's going to be food system collapse, ecosystem collapse, and then they're not going to be able to create the things that they're creating today because of how they've contributed to the problem. And so for them, if they actually shift from quarterly profits or thinking a few months into the future or thinking about how they line the pockets of shareholders, they can recognize that we're not actually going to even exist as an entity in a few years' time. And so there are multiple pressures that are now happening. And of course, civil disobedience is also another really important pressure when you have governments like the UK government, which is largely choosing an action on the climate crisis or saying climate change is important while still investing in new oil and gas projects. You need people, if you have the privilege to do so, to actually go to the streets and create enough disruption that the economy is forced to stop and that leaders are forced to actually take much more transformative action. So change is inevitable. It's just a matter of whether companies choose to disrupt themselves before that disruption comes by way of regulation or the climate crisis literally stopping their ability to operate.
Yeah, I personally felt that for a very long time. Like how, there's a lot of people who, like, they're very ignorant towards what's happening, and maybe they know, they're very aware, but like a face value of it's okay to like kind of exploit it right now, and we'll over time get used to it, or it's gonna get better without actually doing any efforts towards it. So there's a lot of notion that's not being addressed. So what about all of the difference you've made to the world? Is it something you've done it over time, but how do you feel about them? Like, and all the people you've been able to get together and make them aware and more educated towards what they can do?
Yeah, well, I think, more and more when we talk about the climate crisis, we realize that it's not a crisis of technology. It's not a crisis of resources or science. We've had the knowledge that we needed to solve this crisis for decades, right? ExxonMobil, a huge oil and gas company, knew about the climate crisis, back in the 60s, right? And we've developed the renewable technology we need. We've developed the business technology we need. It's not a crisis of resource. It's a crisis of morality at the end of the day. This year we saw 33 million people displaced in Pakistan. We saw 1.5 million people flooded in Nigeria. They didn't even make the headlines. We saw drought across Europe. We saw hurricanes. This is a mere trailer from 1.3 degrees of warming, let alone an additional, 2 degrees of warming. And so the climate crisis is already here. And yet the very sad reality is that the people who have contributed least to the climate crisis are the ones who are already paying its worst impacts. And effectively, anytime a company decides to prioritize its profits for the next year, it's deciding to sacrifice frontline communities. It's really sad and it's horrible to say, but that is the reality. It's a choice. If you have the information, you can't plead ignorance. You have to recognize that it's a choice. And so, lots of us in countries like the UK, yes, we will continue to experience drought, and even it was 45 degrees here a few months ago, which had never happened before in recorded human history. We're going to experience climate change, but nowhere near to the extent of most of the world's population. And so people who are in a place of privilege, people who do have the resource to take action, the knowledge to take action, we have a responsibility to do so. And I think most of the people I've worked with, whether it's counseling heads of state or working with decision makers in business, are waking up to this privilege and to this responsibility. And again, are struggling to live with the moral crisis that is happening within themselves, whether it's in response to seeing the people who are already dying because of the climate crisis, or if it's because they're looking to the future and they're saying the world that I'm passing over to my kids is dramatically going to change. So I think more and more of us are waking up to this as a justice issue, a human rights crisis. And what I love about working with young people is that it's so intuitive, right? Even within a lot of businesses, they ask us, okay, so should we focus on social problems or environmental problems, right? Which is such a stupid question because they're completely intrinsically interlinked, right? Humans are expressions of nature, and also humans inherently are not bad, but we live within systems that make it really difficult to do the right thing and to live responsibly. And so, young people, by contrast, can see the intersectionality of the problems, can see that prison reform relates to girls' education, which relates to reproductive rights, which relates to sustainability and our built environment, And so when we see this tapestry of interconnected problems, we're also aware of the fact that we can plug into any of those issues. So as much as the climate crisis can be incredibly overwhelming, we have to remind ourselves that it is a product of interconnected problems, from the food that we eat, the clothes we wear, to how we get around the cities we live. And with that knowledge comes the realization that, I can take ownership of one piece of that problem. So for me, that's mental health and climate. For you, that might be fast fashion, or it might be education or whatever. And when we realize that impact comes from focus, we realize that if I own this one piece of the equation, then someone else somewhere will own another piece of it, right? And we can link up. And that's what I think is so exciting about seeing this emerging generation, is when we understand how to channel those feelings into action, we see that we can actually be part of creating a world by our own design. We don't have to sit idly by with these systems we've inherited. There has never been a greater moment in history to rethink so much of how we live. And for me, I feel so grateful for the fact that I get to be alive at such an influential moment in history.
Wow, that is insightful.
I had the same exact word when she spoke, and I was like, "This is so nice." And then to the same point, I was like, "We relate."
Exactly. And she spoke about the emerging generation and just being a part of that and having the ability to make change, having the creativity and the resources. It makes me feel so nice about myself.
We started off by feeling like powerless, and then you go to how much ability you have to change. It makes you feel like you can do something.
So I want to ask, do you have any questions for us as being people who are having the realization of the power that we have only now?
I'm so glad that I get to ask you a question. This is much more preferred to being interrogated, as much as I've loved the interrogation. I'd love to hear from each of you, what is a problem maybe within the climate crisis, understanding that all these issues are interconnected. What's a problem that ignites a fire in your belly personally, and how might you want to show up and solve that problem?
I mean, there's been several things. And I guess there have just been little pickups that I've noticed from every country I've lived in. Like in Brunei, one of the most painful things that I would see were dead predator animals that you wouldn't normally have to see. And it was of various causes. It was either because they were being hunted, because they would keep coming into homes. similar to Australia, in Brunei, you always had animals coming in your homes. I was fighting a monitor lizard once after school at home, casually. But seeing dead animals was something that caught my attention. That was like, I realized that was incorrect, even though I was pretty young. Moving to India, I am an athlete. And I realized that every weekend, for all of my club games, they kept getting harder, not because of the opponents, because of the sun. I mean, we've hit heats this summer that are worse than ever before. And right after the heat, we had rains that prolonged into the end of September and even into early October, which was not right. That had never happened. And just little pickup things like that that have made everyday life for me in some way or the other difficult. Those have been things that I've realized that are incorrect, and they've always made me want to do something about it because it's something that kept obstructing my daily life and something that reminded me on a daily basis that there's a problem, there's an environmental problem, and I'm a part of the problem until I do something about it. So those are a few of the things that sparked the fire in me.
Well, for me, it's quite literal. Like it's literally forest fires. It could be minute things that you do in daily life, like forest fires could be from like camping or like even as simple as smoking. And it's so much effects that can be caused. Like there's a lot of animals that are dying, like how Urva said, it's very painful to watch it. Then there's so much pollution and the amount of people that are suffering with like respiratory diseases. And it's like you can do nothing about it because you can't go out there and be like stopping the forest fires, but you have the power to control on what you do around them and how you can save them. But I feel like a lot of people are not aware. So for example, you can take my personal experience. Just until like 2 years ago, I had absolutely no clue what caused forest fires. We need so much more interaction with people and getting to know what really causes people to not go back and think about it. I wouldn't encourage being anxious about the environment, but more concerned and step forward. So I think it's forest fires.
Yeah, and I think, as you kind of go on your own journey of learning and education around these issues, it really helps to try and think about how you peel back the layers. So if you look at forest fires or deforestation, for example, the two driving causes of deforestation are animal agriculture. So in places like the Amazon, largely beef production, and in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, it's largely palm oil production, right? And then you ask a question, okay, well then if it's cows and palm oil, who's responsible for creating those things? Oh, okay, palm oil is in 70% of supermarket products, and it's primarily being funded by companies like Unilever and Procter and Gamble and Kellogg's, these big companies that own much of the world's, supermarket products and agricultural systems. And then it's the same with beef. You can actually go, okay, well, who's actually producing the beef, etc. What's the change that needs to happen? Okay, we need to get rid of palm oil, or we need to find more sustainable alternatives. Or with beef, we need to transition to more plant-based diets, right? Or in the other example, around like seeing big game dying. Okay, well, perhaps that's because of drought, which has direct relations to the climate crisis, or maybe it's because of poaching. And oftentimes people poach because they don't have alternative income streams. So how do we not just persecute poachers? How do we actually ensure that they have alternative localized economies in the places that they live so that they're not driven to poaching, right? So you can start to ask these questions that really get beneath the surface of why does this problem exist? Because you can understand it on a superficial level, or you can go a little bit deeper. And then you can really think about, okay, what's the piece that I want to play, right? So if you're then interested in palm oil, you can say, okay, well, I want to get involved in campaigning, or I want to go directly to that company to have a conversation, or I want to understand what alternative ingredients there are, right? So the problems are very big, but it's so important to kind of find your piece in that equation. And to share a really valuable resource that we recommend to everyone, it's called Regeneration. If you go to regeneration.org, there's a website inspired by a book, which is the most comprehensive plan of climate solutions that's ever been created. And in fact, the only comprehensive plan of climate solutions that's been created. And it goes into problem by problem. So it will go into coral bleaching or deforestation or wildfire or drought. And it will actually uncover, here are the things that contribute. And what's really cool is that it specifically spotlights the companies that are contributing the most to those problems. And Paul Hawken, the scientist behind this resource, has done something very cheeky, which is that he's added the contact details of the CEOs of those organizations. So you can actually directly communicate with the people in the position to actually do something about it. And you can also look at what are the individual actions that I can take in my community to try and change this issue. So there's so much to learn always. And the great thing is there are now all of these incredible resources at our fingertips so we can keep learning and educating ourselves.
I think that's awesome. I love how there's so much to learn, and then there's so much reach right now. Like 10 years ago, this wouldn't be possible. But then at least we can do something about it. I'm really happy about that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the beautiful thing about the internet as well. It's the great democratizer of information. So whenever we do have a question, you can just go there, or you can reach out to Force of Nature as well, and we can help you figure out, what you want that focus to be as well.
Thank you very much, Clover, for your time. This has been fantastic. You have enlightened me a great deal, and I could not be more thankful. So thank you so much for your time, Clover.